I have probably a few questions. First of all, what can you tell me about the United American Indians of New England?
United American Indians of New England is a native led organization. We came into existence in 1970 after my father, who had been invited to address a fancy banquet that the Commonwealth of Massachusetts was putting on to commemorate the 350th anniversary of the arrival of the Pilgrims. And he sent a copy of the speech in advance, as they asked him to. When they read it, they said, "You can't give this speech, it's too inflammatory, the theme is brotherhood." But all his speech talked about was the truth as to what happened. Uh, the Pilgrims opened my ancestors' graves, they stole beans and corn, funerary objects, and so when it went out over the Moccasin Telegraph that he'd been censored, members of AIM and other Native American people went to Plymouth on Thanksgiving Day, 1970, and declared it a national day of mourning, and that's how United American Indians became in existence.
Okay. I've been reading a lot about your Wampanoag, right?
Yes, and my preferred pronunciation is Wampanoag.
And I appreciate the instruction because I don't know a lot about your people.
Hmm.
Now, I understand that in the beginning that your tribe was allied with the Pilgrims or allied with the Pilgrims.
In the beginning, I wouldn't say an ally. They made an agreement for mutual defense, those kind of things. But over time, toward the end, they did become allies with the Pilgrims to fight the Narragansett. They look at the first Thanksgiving in this country as 1621, when the native population and the Pilgrims sat down, and it wasn't really a Thanksgiving, it was a Harvest Home Festival. And 1617, which would have been 3 years prior to the arrival of the Pilgrim, um, I don't think the word Thanksgiving was really ever used. Yeah.
Now, I was reading about King Philip
Hmm.
and the King Philip's War. So basically, after time, things broke down with the new settlers. King Philip's brother was poisoned.
Yeah, King Philip's older brother, Wamsutta. After Massasoit died, um, of course, his oldest son became sachem or chief, and within a couple of years of his becoming chief, he was summoned to Plymouth. And I don't want to say summoned, but the people in Plymouth wanted to talk to him, and his seat of power or his headquarters was in Bristol, Rhode Island, and it was a few miles away. It was a day and a half, almost a 2-day walk over. But he went to Plymouth, and they sat down, and they had a parley or whatever you want to call it. And when he got ready to leave, he got about halfway home, and he died. And we tend to think that he was poisoned. And of course, after he died, his younger brother, King Philip, or Metacom, was appointed chief or took over the chiefship. I mean, I don't know how that all worked. And he knew that the end was basically near. They had encroached on the land, they'd stolen land, they'd broken agreements. So he went to war in 1775, and that was King Philip's War. And it lasted about a year. And if he had been able to get an alliance with the Mohawk, it may have come out differently. But he was murdered in Rhode Island, and they cut off both of his hands, and they cut off his head, and they displayed his head in Plymouth from 1676. His head was displayed on a pike in the center of Plymouth for at least 20 or 25 years. And that was the outcome of King Philip's War.
Yeah. So basically every time that there was a quote unquote Indian war, In other words, the settlers went out and massacred yet another village full of people, like the Mystic River
That was
incident.
that was the Pequots who were massacred.
Right. And
And
go ahead.
one thing I do want to say is when the English attacked the Pequots in Mystic, the Narragansetts were allied with the English at the time. But when the English attacked, the Narragansetts basically threw down their weapons and said, "Wait a minute, we can't get involved with this. It kills too many people." Because it wasn't our way to kill people. It was, when I say our way, it wasn't the native way to kill people. The idea was, well, the Sioux had counting coup, which meant it was more honorable to go up and touch your enemy than it was to kill him. But when they saw what the English were doing with the elders, women, and children, the Narragansetts basically said, we've had enough of this.
And then after that, the settlers had a Thanksgiving feast, correct?
They did. It was the first real day of general Thanksgiving, to where the governor of the Massachusetts Bay Colony, or, well, the Plymouth Colony, however you want to look at it in those days, declared it a day of general Thanksgiving for the safe return of the men that went down to get involved with the massacre of the Pequots. And that was the real, in my opinion, first day of Thanksgiving in the New World, if you will.
Right. So then we fast forward to George Washington, and by that time they were having days of Thanksgiving for vanquishing the brutal savages about every month or so.
Yeah,
And
George Washington did that, but the real first national day of Thanksgiving was declared by Abraham Lincoln in 1863, as sort of a thing to try to bring the country together because of the Civil War and all these kind of things. But it
right,
did not take off big time until the early 1900s.
right. And the day before that he declared this National Day of Thanksgiving was when he dispatched the troops to Minnesota to round up the Dakota.
Exactly. So, it's the idea that why we do National Day of Mourning and why United American Indians of New England came into existence was to tell the truth. Because the school books, the history books, a lot of people don't realize that prior to the Pilgrims arriving in the Northeast up here, what happened was the English and the French and so forth had gone up into Canada. The English were down in the Virginias. They don't want to talk about the Jamestown colony, which ended up turning to cannibalism in order to survive because they couldn't. And they were attacked down there by the native population and basically wiped out. But the history books seem to like to look at it as nothing happened in this country until 1620. But we go into the 1500s, you had the Spanish that went up into what's now New Mexico and Arizona, Mexico, all those areas. They were over here,
Florida.
Florida, over here long before the Pilgrims arrived. But everybody looks at it, I shouldn't say everybody, but a lot of people look at it and say, oh, well, when the Pilgrims arrived, that's when this country started.
Right. Well, that's the history that's taught in the schools.
Right. You're exactly right. And a thing like the Mayflower Compact, they look at that as being like the first whatever of democracy over in this area. And when I say this area, the eastern and northeastern part of the United States. But the Mayflower Compact was nothing more than an agreement about a bunch of white men and women and so forth sticking together because it was a commercial venture from day one. The Pilgrims were able to book passage on the Mayflower because some gentlemen wanted to make money over here. So they financed the ship, they financed the the soldiers that came over to help, and did all these kind of things. And the whole idea was they had to make a return on their investment. So how could it be this great, beautiful enterprise or this experiment in democracy and so forth if they were beholden to a bunch of people who financed their trip over here? But they don't talk about that in the history books.
Right. The Pilgrims started out in England, and the reason that they're called, well, they're Puritans, but the reason this group was called Pilgrims was they went to Holland because, well, they didn't get along with the notion of having a state church.
Right.
And of course, the Church of England was not, happy with anybody who wasn't belonging to the Church of England, which was a state
And
church.
that's no different than the Catholic Church today. It's no different
Right.
than, than any of these organized religions. And that's why when they tell us that, oh, they left England to escape religious persecution, if you will, and then they went to Holland, where Holland was one of the most liberal uh, countries as far as they didn't really care what your religion was.
Right, but they weren't real happy about being in Holland because the children were getting corrupted by having all these worldly influences around them, and they didn't have the skills they ran out of money, the money that they brought from England, because they didn't have the skills to survive in the Holland economic environment. So they ended up going back to England again.
Yeah,
And that's how they ended up on a ship going to the United States. It wasn't that they couldn't have escaped religious persecution by just going to Holland. It was they didn't have the wherewithal to be able to support themselves. Their religious beliefs weren't standing up by themselves in a secular environment.
yeah, I can agree with that. But the idea is they made it look like they're the ones that came over here because they were trying to escape, persecution and all these kind of things, but they don't talk about the fact that someone had to back their venture. If they didn't have any money to stay in Holland and then they went back to England, uh, somebody backed them up, and it was nothing more than a commercial venture. You
Right,
know,
and they were supposed to what? Bring back gold or
pubs,
furs, or what was the point?
whatever. You know, I don't know what their exact contract was with these
Hmm.
or these investors, but the idea that it's been sold to the population over here that they came over here so they could practice religious freedom. And that to me is the biggest pile of BS going. They were able to finagle funds, they were able to do whatever in order to get passage over here, and they were supposed to land in Virginia, and they ended up going north because they missed, and all these kind of things, and they stepped onto Plymouth Rock, and they had all the, they brought over all these beautiful ideas, and they were met by a bunch of savages. But if it hadn't been for the so-called savages, um, the Wampanoag people, Massasoit, and his group, they wouldn't have made it through the first winter. And we were, everybody sat down in the autumn. They don't know the exact date of 1621. Had a great big meal, and they had a great time for like 3 days, and everyone lived happily ever after. But what they don't want to tell people that within 50 years, all of that had gone. Well, I hate to use the term "gone south," but it was gone because of
Right.
broken agreements, broken promises, and as I've always said, that the United States government, which is long after the Pilgrims, um, signed over 360 treaties with native nations throughout this area, North America, and they've only kept one. The United States government has only kept one, and that is we're going to take your land.
Yep.
That's the only treaty that the United States
They're
has.
still doing it.
Exactly. The Bureau of Indian Affairs is like they owe Native nations for leasing their land, using their land, whatever, a few $1 billion, but the Bureau of Indian Affairs can't find it.
Yeah.
And these are the kind of things that we protested in '69, that 1969, that they were going to take over some abandoned federal property, because it used to be, if the federal government has no more use for a piece of land, it should be turned over or turned back to their rightful owner, which would be the native population. But right here in this area, we have the old Weymouth Air Station. That wasn't, when the government decided they didn't want it, it wasn't turned over to native people. They left it open and let developers come in, and you could buy up a piece of it and do this and so, do that. And that was one of the agreements that was made, and I can't off the top of my head remember the exact date, but that's one of the things. If it's abandoned federal property, then it should become part of somebody's reservation. And they look at us and say, well, you've got your casinos and all this. Well, there's also a myth out there that people think that because I'm Native American, I don't pay income tax. And
Mm-hmm.
I hate to say it, but I pay income tax. I've paid it every year. And these kind of things, they think that, well, you guys have got it made. Well, we don't. And these are the truths that need to be told in 2015. They needed to be told in 1970. They needed to be told 20, 40, 60, 80, 100 years prior to that. And this is what we're trying to do with the National Day of Mourning in Plymouth.